one of the great things about doing this tour, which by the way, it's been a tough 2 years that we haven't done it. I'm glad to see we're all here among the living, if you'll pardon that expression given the setting. But I just found out from the descendant of one of our earlier pioneer families that, unbeknownst to me, after all the years of doing the cemetery tour and involvement with KHS, that, where's Louita Hawkinson? There she is. That a whole slew of the Fish family are over here that I didn't even know was over here. All the early Houghton fishes are right over there unmarked, which I didn't realize. So, sorry. Didn't mean to get too sidetracked. Thank you for coming today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt McCauley. I have been researching and writing about Kirkland history since the old Kirkland Historic Commission was refounded after a hiatus at the end of the 1970s. It was sort of refounded by Louita over here in the back and some of the original members back in the early 90s. And I kind of grew up as a kid in the Juanita area. We lived on property that was then rural back in those days. The family bought the property in 1963 from a family that had it as a very, very large parcel. There was woods and pasture all over the place, and this was an elderly couple who were kind of getting ready to subdivide their land, so they sold to my grandpa, and then my grandpa broke it up and, you know, gave parcel to my dad, my uncle, my great uncle. And so growing up right next door to this then elderly couple, who were not my relatives, but their last name, their names are Hilma and Charlie Fowler. So growing up next to them, their grandmother, we used to call her Grandma Fowler, was like a surrogate grandmother, and she'd tell me stories as a little kid about riding on the ferry, and oh yeah, where your house is now was where we had our chicken coop, and all these sorts of things. So as a little kid, it kind of piqued my curiosity. I'll point out her granddaughter, Cindy, happens to be right here. So it kind of, what goes around comes around. But I, back in the early 70s, as a kid at A.G. Bell, a little classmate of mine had a mom that wrote as kind of a part-time feature writing job on the old East Side Journal newspaper. She wrote this book in 1975, the first real popular history written about Kirkland, and I got a hold of this as a little kid, and I just devoured it. I was fascinated by it. You know, if I wasn't watching Speed Racer or something, then, you know, I'm going to be looking at this. I later found out as an adult, and I got a little more seriously into it, she actually did some pretty amazing research for that time. This is without computers. Just, you know, there are files down at KHS of her written correspondence, letters to people that had been born and lived around here in the 1800s. So what she left behind has really been the foundation for most of what we do now in Kirkland history as far as what we know about it. So that's kind of what happened and how I happened to be here. In the very early 90s, I used to write a column for the old Kirkland Courier newspaper, and that kind of is what got me going on it, and then with KHS and kind of getting all that back together. But today we're here to talk about the Kirkland Cemetery, and the first thing I want to kind of remind everybody is the focus of our tour today is on the pioneer era, the Kirk-boom, and the period immediately following that. There are too many stories in this cemetery to tell. There are too many interesting people. If you have family members here, I can't talk about everybody. As a matter of fact, I could do multiple tours. This is more a pioneer, early days focused tour. I have a friend who runs a project called Seattle Civil War Legacy. We're talking about doing one maybe later in the summer, early fall, just about the Civil War veterans and their service, just that focus. But I mean, I could do tour, you know, baby boomer edition, you know, all kinds of things. So again, we only have a couple of hours really to go through this. So there's so many people I'm not going to be able to talk about. So if you have relatives interred here, you know, and I don't talk about them or something, please don't be offended. It's just a matter of having to pick what I can talk about in that period of time. I would also add that, like several people have mentioned earlier, we have a couple of folks here with the maps, and I have a friend from the city of Kirkland. here as well who can help us. If you have relatives interred here and you're not sure where their graves are located, we can help you with that today to find out where they're at, and we'll get you precisely on top of them, whether there is or is not a marker. So if you want to hang out afterwards for a little bit and you want to do that, we can help you. The other thing I would mention is, while this is completely free, we're glad that you came. If you do choose to donate, is there a donation jar, Louis? Okay. If you choose to donate, we use the proceeds of this tour to buy markers for people whose graves, for whatever reason, have been unmarked. It kind of started out with, oh, you know, if they have a lot of historical ties or whatever, and it's just kind of gotten to the point where we're just trying to get everybody marked. So your donations will go to a good cause. We just got a pallet of, what was it, like 35 markers or something like that. And I would just add that Jason, the head of the Parks Department for the city of Kirkland, has been stupendous in helping us with this. The city puts the markers in, does the legwork, doesn't charge us a dime for that. So kudos to them. I would add too that normally going into Memorial Day, there's been more cleanup happening on the cemetery. The way we timed it, that hasn't been the case here, but the city usually does a great job on keeping it up. And I would add that the guys who work doing the work here in the cemetery itself are usually just amazing. They take this very, very seriously, and I've seen them go above and beyond. I've seen them stop what they're doing and help somebody because they're looking for a relative or whatever. So I do want to give them a big shout out. As some of you may know, this is actually a city park, but it wasn't always a park, and it's kind of central to the history of Kirkland overall. So just to kind of get started, if we roll back to the early 1800s, you have primarily native habitation in this area. The dominant tribe was a branch of what were called the Duwamish people. This was a group centered around sort of the south end of Lake Washington down through the Green River, Duwamish River. But hunter-gatherer societies, a lot of people don't realize, required tremendous amounts of acreage per individual for their foraging, for their hunting and gathering. So their population was very small. What ended up happening was, after the first white contact, you had various diseases, as always happens, you know, when you have the different cultures in those days or before. You know, going over to Africa, if you were a European explorer, the lifespan you had on continental Africa was typically under a year. You would die because of the various diseases and things that they didn't have vaccinations for. So sadly, the same thing happened here to a lot of the native tribes. So by the time Seattle's first founders came along around 1851, the Duwamish population was probably around half of what it had been prior to that. And in our area, it was centered on a village down by today's Renton, which at that time, lake was 9.5 feet higher because the ship canal hadn't been cut. So you actually had an outflow river down there called the Black River that fed into the Cedar River that then fed into the Duwamish River. So the people didn't actually, their village wasn't right on the lake. It was at the confluence of the Cedar and Black Rivers, because that's where salmon would run through. You know, why would you go live in the swampy bank of the lake if you could be right here on the nice river and have your food going by all the time? So there was not a lot of villages per se in and around the lake, but there definitely were a few settlement areas, and there's reason to believe there had been a seasonal little, for lack of a better term, village at what is now downtown Kirkland. There's been some research on that lately, but they should have talked to Kirkland Heritage Society because we've had some really old research on it. And we do know that the very first homesteaders of what is now the downtown Kirkland area found bodies in a tree in half canoes or boxes, which was the Duwamish customary burial practice. This was done a lot over by Foster Island, but we actually had that here in what was now the downtown Kirkland area. So that's just a nice little trivia point. In the 1850s, the first American who wrote of seeing Lake Washington was an individual named Isaac Eby, who came through the river system from a cedar canoe. He was paddling along, and he described having seen the lake, and it was clear, it was beautiful, That's the first record we have of it. It was a bit of a journey for the Seattle people to come over and look at the lake, but ultimately they did, and the most common route they took was the native trail that we now call Madison Street, from what is now Madison Park into downtown. There was another one across the portage at Montlake that went to the south end of Lake Union. So the natives had a lot of exchange back and forth with their people, their affiliated people in eastern Washington. So they already had some routes and trails already put through, and in some cases some of our major roads were built up over those trails, including the one that goes from Carillon Point over the top of the hill to Redmond, which was here when the first white settlers came along, because it had been one of those Indian trails. But the big year for the east side was 1870, because in the early days, what the government did is they had something called the cadastral survey system, which divided up the land into grids. Big giant squares called townships were then divided up into smaller squares called sections. So if you've ever heard references to section, range, township, those are coordinates according to the cadastral survey system. There are 3 townships that comprise the east side for the most part. There's a part of a fourth for Finn Hill, and if you consider Mercer Island part of the east side, there's half of Mercer Island's a fifth. But there are 3 main ones. 24 is down around Renton, Newcastle. 25 is Bellevue through much of Kirkland to about Central, and then, up to Juanita Bay Park. And then 26 is roughly Juanita Bay Park north. So 24 opened in 1865 because they found coal in Newcastle and Renton, so they wanted that land available as quickly as possible. 25 and 26 opened in 1870. So what that meant is prior to 1870, you couldn't get free land from the government. After 1870, you could come over here, file with the land office in Olympia, and you were entitled to 160 acre square of land called a quarter section. There was also 80 acre sections, but most people got a 160 acre section, and you could either buy it for $2.50 an acre cash, which was double because of our proximity to the Northern Pacific Railroad right of way. Been a little bit farther out of the area, it would have been $1.25 an acre. But if you didn't have the cash, you could do improvements and do what was called proving up your claim, meaning you'd sit there for a certain number of years, you'd do some improvements and things, and then the government would just give you title, less some filing fees. So in 1870, you had a little mini land rush of people coming over here. But the first family that we know of were called the Pophams. It was a lady whose name was actually Nancy McGregor and her 2 grown sons, who took land claims on what is now Yarrow Bay. So they were what was known at the time as squatters originally. They're just in there waiting for the land to be opened up. After 1870, they were able to file their claims, and you started getting people coming and settling along the shore. The shoreland was the first that people wanted to take, because even then, location, waterfront. But we had a couple of people that filled in along between Yarrow Bay and Juanita Bay. The earliest geographic descriptions of the area, Yarrow Bay area was referred to as Pleasant Bay, and the Juanita Bay area by the early 1870s had been named Juanita. Later, the Pleasant Bay area, the name was changed to Houghton, related to their congregational church receiving as a gift a bell from a family named Houghton back in Boston. So in those earliest days, you had a Houghton district, and then you had a Juanita district where people lived. Actually, the first Juanita Bay people were 2 very young guys in their late teens that were loggers, Martin Hubbard and Henry Goldmeyer. Hubbard stayed there throughout his life till he drowned in 1887 he was a mailman by rowboat, and he drowned out in the bay. Goldmeyer sold his land within a couple of years, died a couple of years later on a log raft in the Sammamish River, fell, hit his head, body washed up a couple of days later, and was found by some natives. But he had sold his land on Juanita Bay to the widow of one of the very first Denny Party members, Charles Terry. And his wife's name was Mary Terry. Her real name was Jane. so Mary Jane, she went by Jane, and her last name, her maiden name, had been Russell. So actually, prior to getting married, her name was Jane Russell. For any of you that remember the 1940s act, there was a fixation of Howard Hughes. That Jane Russell. But Charles Terry died at age 37 of TB, and when he died, they were the largest residential landowners in Seattle. She was the richest widow in Seattle. She ended up buying Goldmeyer's land claim as sort of a second home, summer home, which she called, people would name their estates. For example, the guy that settled at what is now Madison Park called it Laurel Shade. Hers she named Juanita. So that's where we get the name Juanita. We see it referred to as Mrs. Terry's Ranch, and then all kinds of different spellings of Juanita. The W, everything else. But by all indications, that was how we got the name Juanita up there, as Mrs. Terry. And sadly, she ended up dying at age 37 as well. But our first settlers along the lake bought and sold their land. They would trade it. You could trade it and sell your interest to somebody, even if you hadn't proved up your title yet. So one of the families we're going to talk about came in 1872. Their name was French. You had a family named Nelson that had grown sons that took much of the land north of Central, the west of Market, part of Norkirk, up to Juanita Bay. Was Nelson and his wife, and then their sons. The downtown Kirkland area was claimed by a man named DeMott. South of him was a man named Ed Church. Then you had Harry French, who I'm going to talk about more, and his parents right next to him to the south. And then a family named Curtis came along and bought the Papa property. So it was very slow over here. There wasn't a lot to do. A lot of these guys would work in Seattle, during the week, earn some wages for Henry Yesler's sawmill or someplace, and then come back and work on their property on the lake, when they could. But what happened is, in the late 1880s, 1886, 1887, a British steel manufacturer named Peter Kirk started looking for a place to expand his business that he had owned with his family. They've been generations of iron and steel making in Cumbria, the northern part of England, at a place called Workington, located on a little inlet called Moss Bay. He came over with some of his key people, started exploring the United States. Their objective was to manufacture steel rails for railroads, because that was, a big boom product in the 1880s. So he came and he traveled through the east. He came through Pennsylvania, through Pittsburgh and that area, and then ended up coming and exploring around the Washington Territory area, looked at a number of potential sites, Ellensburg, Tacoma, Cle Elum, a few others. What was his biggest concern were the raw materials for making iron that could be then smelted iron that could then be turned into steel, which was steel, iron ore, lime, which they use for flux in the process, and a type of coal, superior grade coal called coking coal, that could burn hot enough to satisfy what was called the Bessemer process, which basically involved smelting the ore into iron and then taking the iron ingots and injecting air at a really high temperature to essentially turn it into steel. And you had to get it super, super hot to be in these Bessemer converters. That required the coking coal. So he was looking for resources, he was looking for shipping, he was juggling a number of variables in his mind. And we don't know all the details, but he met a man who had come from Indiana. He had been a university president very briefly at what became Indiana State University. He only lasted 1 year in that position. He got fired for expelling the kids of some politically powerful people. So he got busted and came west with his wife. But he very quickly, this guy was characterized as a promoter's promoter. A man, as they said at the time, of very unusual talents. He's one of these wheeler dealers that could just sell anything to anybody. He came to Seattle and very quickly became, without any investment on his own, he became the controlling partner slash publisher of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper, which was the main news. I mean, that's like controlling the media, of all the media. I mean, something Mark Zuckerberg or something for Seattle back in the 1880s. It was an extremely powerful position. And because of that, he also ended up controlling the King County Republican Party. And it was a one-party place in those days, and that was the party. So he more or less had the attitude, he didn't want to be a politician, he wanted to own and control politicians, which actually is probably the much better strategy. He had a vision for industrializing the east side. He had taken steps to start a company to run a rail line from Black River Junction at the south up to what we now know as Woodinville up at the north. And the idea was, with this rail line, you would have all this industrial manufacturing. He'd always wanted it to center on a steel enterprise. And here's Peter Kirk. Hey, let's talk. So they met with some of the prominent people of the time, Judge Burke and many of these others. And one way or the other, it was decided that it would be located on Lake Washington. They incorporated a company called the Moss Bay Iron and Steel Company of America, and an associated land company called the Kirkland Land and Improvement Company. The new town site was going to be called Kirkland. We don't exactly know how that was determined. Obviously, it was to honor Peter Kirk. From Peter Kirk's great-great-granddaughter has recently written a book called The Pioneering Life of Peter Kirk, which I heartily recommend. She's a KHS member, a co-researcher friend of ours, and she shares our belief that likely Kirk himself did not want the town to be called Kirkland, that was probably somebody else said, Peter, we have to call it after you. No, please don't. No, yes, we're going to do that. It's probably one of those kind of things. You know, he was not like, say, a Donald Trump kind of character that wanted to put his name all over everything. He was a pretty, modest kind of guy, very different than Leigh Hunt. He was more of a brainy, sciencey kind of guy. He had patents and inventions and all kinds of things. So it's likely that others chose the name. Then Leigh Hunt, acting on behalf of the Land and Improvement Company, started buying vast swaths of land from these settlers. And most of the prominent settlers, the prominent homesteaders, sold at least some of their land to the Kirkland Land and Improvement Company. Why did Leigh Hunt do it personally? Why did he buy it personally? In those days, there were what were called alien land laws, such that foreign nationals could not just buy land here. You had to have an American buy the land here. So that was part of why Hunt did that. So when you look up the old sales records, you see so-and-so settler selling to Leigh Hunt. Well, that's why. He's doing it on behalf of the company. The idea for their town was going to be a model town based on a place called Pullman, Illinois, that was progressive for its time. It was going to have parks and churches and lots of nice amenities for the workers. It was going to be a nice place to live and work. It wasn't going to be some horrible 19th century company town that, sounds really terrible to live in. It was going to be nice. That was important to Kirk. He was a humanitarian kind of a guy. But it was a private township, a company town, and the Land and Improvement Company owned all the land, other than a rectangle south of us over where Costco and Forbes, everybody knows where Forbes Lake is, up by Costco. Between Forbes Lake and the Costco area is where the mill complex was going to be located. They actually began construction on it, got pretty far into it until the construction ended in 1892. This over here is the mill, as it was, it's probably its peak of construction progress. This road here connected to 7th Avenue into the original downtown, in what had been the envisioned Kirkland downtown area, which was Market Street and 7th, not on the water where it is now. Now, an important part of the town, of the model town, was a cemetery. That's where this comes in. This was originally platted in 1890. We have the original plat up here. It was 4 quadrants with a fountain in the middle. This is a fountain that was put in much later, thankfully. It was never actually built in the old days. It was just planned. So you start with these 4 squares, these 4 quadrants, and then over time, as years passed, other areas were added in. Lawn Haven is over here on this side. That was an addition. The saddest part of the cemetery is right along the fence over here. It's called Baby Haven. We don't include that in the tour. There's just, most of these stories are stories about people who live nice, full lives. It's just a way of talking about Kirkland history. There's nothing but sadness in that section of the cemetery, believe me. And then this section over here, Everett section, was named after Mayor Harry Everett, as the first person who turned up there. So it's part of a big expansion. But this is the original part. These were originally roads, so you could get hearses in. And then between these were alleys that people could access to, to get in and do stuff. So that was the original layout, and there were 3 commissioners who were appointed from the most prominent residents that then privately oversaw the cemetery. They started selling plots starting in 1890. So that sort of sets the stage, and we'll kind of say, okay, so here we are, 1890, we've got the cemetery. The Harry French, DeMott, and Church were the main directors, and it was really a lot of connection to the Congregational Church. They were all members of that church. So we can actually start walking now. I'll show you some of the various parts and some of the people that are here. Harry French was considered the father of the Kirkland Cemetery up to his death in 1937. Highly regarded family. Harry is over here. His mom and dad, Samuel was his dad's name, but his middle name was Foster, and everybody called him Foss. The mom, Caroline, was actually a fascinating character in her own right. She was really the mother, in many respects, of the Kirkland Congregational Church, which was the dominant church at the time, and it was a big deal for the people around here. In those days, those people were so literate, and that you would have their different minor theological differences between Protestant sects, between Baptist and Methodist and Congregationalists. People would debate this stuff, and they really knew a lot. But she was an early leader in the Congregational Church and a strong mover of founding it. The early documents are all in her hand, where she's written things out, and very interesting lady. For those of you that, when we get back there, if any of you see one of my books for sale, Early Kirkland, there's a lady in 1890 with a steamboat in the background. She's carrying an umbrella, standing next to the lake. That's Caroline French. He was an early hobby photographer, and he had this old wooden box camera and tripod that, thanks to his grandson, who is still alive, donated to KHS. He walked around. He was also an investor in the Kirkland enterprise. So the Masonic Hall in Kirkland, located on 7th and Market Street, the one that's got like antique shops and stuff in the bottom of it, that would be at the northeast corner of 7th and Market. Harry French and Ed Church, one of the other directors of the cemetery, invested in that around 1890, 1891 because of the mill. Because they sold a bunch of their land to the mill company, so they had some cash. So they thought it was going to be a great deal. Put this building up, they were going to be in the heart of the action and have this commercial building. And in 1892, a combination of events, the lack of canal funding to come through from Congress, because a ship canal was vital to the whole plan to ship out the rails they planned to make, and a major economic depression all sort of contributed in different ways and caused the Kirk-boom to go bust. And Harry and Ed more or less lost their investment. $15,000, 1891 was a lot of money. So he also, though, happened to have been a photographer. So he walked around and took photos, like the one that I showed over there of the mill. He had the presence of mind to take some of the pictures of this stuff happening. And a lot of those photos were lost. Some were rounded up when Arlene Ely wrote the Founding Fathers book that I held up earlier in 1975. But a couple of years ago, the weirdest thing happened. I get little alerts from eBay on my phone, and I got a little, Kirkland collectibles, and it's this weird one. Glass plate negatives, Kirkland town site being built. And I'm thinking, did somebody prank me? Am I being punked? Just for me, that would be like really a cruel joke. I looked at it, and a seller in Chehalis had a whole bunch of glass plate negatives for sale. These 5x7 format glass negatives. And I was, how the hell did this happen? Then I started looking more. Harry French's name was written on the boxes. So he had the negatives stored in their original cardboard boxes that the glass plates came in. We don't know how. Somehow, a bunch of these glass plate negatives left the family and ended up in this junk shop in Chehalis. So I called Loida, and we freaked out and had to wait. We were the only bidders. We got them for like $300 something. But we've now kind of put a lot of this together. There were some prints that survived, so that we had the hard prints, but nobody knew where the heck the negatives were. Well, we got a whole box of them. So thanks to Harry French having this hobby, and I say this, people get mad, but a lot of times before you get married, when you're a guy, you have fun, expensive hobbies, but then you get married, you start having kids, and hobbies don't happen that much any longer. So luckily, he had his disposable income and didn't have too many distractions. So he walked around and took all these pictures, which have been of incredible help to us in doing our historic research. Harry and Rosie had a daughter named Olivia, who sadly, she didn't have a super long life. She was also a hobby photographer. And we have her photo album. She graduated from Kirkland High School about 1914, roughly. Oh yeah, Dave Davis. That's Harry French's grandson, yeah, and he's still alive. That's Rosie, and when you see a picture of Harry French at old age, you can see the genes. They look very similar. He was a public school teacher for his entire career. Retired, lives over in the Kitsap Peninsula. He was so kind too. He donated just so many things to KHS of the family, of their various artifacts and relics. Just the other day I was down there holding a book that the Pophams had mailed from Idaho to Caroline in 1883. It was a book of Robert Burns' poetry that it's written in there. This was a gift in 1883 from the first settlers on the east shore of Lake Washington. Wow, we have that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So do you think these look like they were done later, or were those original?
Yeah.
No, this was, well, by 1937, they were using this style of marker very
gotcha,
commonly.
okay.
And then she was 1956.
They didn't do that concrete back then, though, did
Yeah,
they?
they did.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they
that
would.
outside concrete? Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. But yeah, by 56, they were definitely, that's a great question. And they were laying those into concrete so that they would, some of these others they may have gone back and added that to, but at that time that's how they were doing it. Olivia, who was also a photographer, that was Olivia you just showed, right? Okay, so, I'm sorry, I got a little tangent.
I'm following you behind.
And there's Ed Church. This was a recent discovery. The Congregational Church had this photo in a book nobody knew about that had been published privately in 1942. Yeah, there she is. And she was a graduate of Kirkland High School. She had a photo album as well that was, the black pages with a whole bunch of photos that at the time a custom was to hand tint them so they had added color. But they're terrific pictures. It's like you think of a lot of young high school girls today, with their phones and their selfies and all this stuff. And in many respects, these girls in the lake swimming, except they're not wearing bikinis, they're wearing what were called wash dresses for swimming in suits, where they look like full dresses, but they're playing around in the lake and having a great time. So it's actually very charming. And a very different looking shoreline down there at that time. But Olivia married Cuba Davis, and he actually outlived her, and he helped Darlene Ely write Founding Fathers. He provided a lot of access to a lot of the French photographs and things that were still around. And this, of course, is the mom and dad of Dave Davis, who helped us out so much. So, there you have it. And the French house, if any of you remember, down on sort of by Houghton Beach, roughly, on about, I think, 63rd, near where the Bay Shore condos are, that house was built in 1872. Do we have that picture? It was the first frame house on the east side. And yeah, here it is. Thank you. This is the house. That's the French house. And then we have Harry, Caroline, Foss, and this lady right here, her name is Lucy Tuttle. We're going to talk more about her. She was half Duwamish, half white. And then this is her brother. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her brother's first name. Do you remember?
We don't know which one.
We don't know which brother. It's not her oldest brother. I know that for a fact. Miles was her oldest half brother. But that's Lucy Tuttle, because it was very common in those days for mixed kids to spend time living with a white family, not exactly, kind of combination servant. And sometimes they were called their adopted kid. I mean, it was a close relationship. It wasn't some Oliver Twistian kind of thing, for the most part, at least that we know of. But she seems to have had a very good relationship with them. So there they are. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about her. This house sat in its place down there, some of you may recall, till 1978, and miraculously was saved. They're going to put those condos in down there, which they did, but they moved it. So they moved it south about, I don't know, a mile down Lake Washington Boulevard to just where, if you're coming up north Lake Washington Boulevard, Yarrow Bay's over here, then it's like where the keg used to be is over here. And you go up a little ways, there's those first houses off to the right. They moved it up there now. So it's actually still standing, which is pretty nice. But it was there until the 1970s. So there you
Is
have
it
it.
just sitting there, or is
People
it?
live in it. It's restored.
Oh,
But,
people
well,
are living in it.
yeah, it's been remodeled. It's been remodeled, but it's better than tearing it down. You know, that's what I say.
I just
Yeah.
wondered if it was a historical site to visit.
So, the Curtis family. First of all, there's a couple of Curtis family plots. There's another one up over here. They came in 1872 and bought the land that the Pophams had. That Nancy McGregor and William Popham, the brother, one of the brothers. The other one was a little more towards Yarrow Point side. But the Curtis bought a bunch of their property. So this would have been just south of the Frenches, including the land that is now Caroline Point. They came as adults, James and Molly here, with their adult kids from South Dakota. They were not originally from South Dakota. They'd been there for a while as they were kind of coming west. And again, they had adult sons. Walt, here is one of them. They built the second frame house in 1874. And even though they're from South Dakota, they got very early on into steamboating on Lake Washington. They were involved. Oh, is it okay? Yeah, he's right here. Right. And is Molly in there too? Okay, yeah. She's wait, is that Molly? Yeah. She was kind of an interesting case too. She was very, the whole family is musical. As a matter of fact, all these Frenches and them, they would play instruments very regularly because, you know, they have no entertainment, so everybody in the family learns a different instrument and they sit around and play music, or they get together with their neighbors and they play music because, you know, it's, what are you going to do? No Netflix. So, well, of course, it was much better off for them because I think that what that did for their brains was probably a lot better, but I digress. She actually went over to the Territorial University in Seattle to teach music, which was kind of a big deal for its time. But they early on got into steamboating and overall built and operated steamboats for about 50 years between them, which is always kind of interesting that people from South Dakota, who last come from South Dakota, did that. They had a daughter whose name was Florell, and she was married to a man named Benson Northup. Northup. No R. Anybody, you natives here, know where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because they settled a bit farther south than her parents, and the area in which they settled came to be known as North Up. No R. So what ended up happening is at some point, the earliest reference I've seen to it was in the 1920s on a Birken-Farrar land plat. Somebody stuck an R in there, North Rupp. Then King County made road signs that said North Rupp. And then as it grew, the city of Bellevue said, oh look, it's called North Rupp. Sign shop, we need North Rupp. So I have seen on the Bellevue Facebook, people practically come to blows over whether it's North Rupp or North Up. And as this lady pointed out, it is definitely North Up. Benson Northup went on to the newspaper business. He co-founded a Seattle newspaper called the Seattle Post, which later merged with the Seattle Intelligencer to become what some of you may remember as the Seattle Post Intelligencer. But Northup was its own distinct little community, and they had their own steamboat dock on Yarrow Bay that was called Northup Landing. That was just south of the Curtises. So one common theme that you'll sort of see as we go through this stuff and meet some of these people, you're talking about a relatively small population, and you've got a span of time. So, they didn't have swipe apps to date or anything. They just had to be, oh, you're about my age, and let's get married. So these families, these early families from the first days on into even the beginning of the 20th century, these family trees just sort of converge and mingle. And sometimes it's hard to figure them out. They're so interconnected and woven. So in some of these people like the Curtises, you're starting to see the origins of that, and you'll see a little bit more as we go on. But they got into building boats in the lake. They were involved with the first steamboat built on the lake for use on the lake forever. It was a type of scow called the squawk. Somebody we're going to talk about over here named O'Connor, we looked at there in the picture, was also involved in that for a time. But it was essentially a steam scow with a little house on it, and it would run around Lake Washington. It could go right up on the beach, and would also go up in the Sammamish River, which was at that time called the Squawk Slough, and into Lake Sammamish, which was called Squawk Lake, to the settlement that we now call Issaquah, which at the time was called, and you probably guessed this already, Squawk. So they called the boat the Squawk. But it could go all the way up into there, which was a real challenge at the time, because you consider Lake Washington's 9.5 feet higher. Proportionally, as you go up into Lake Sammamish, it gets a little bit higher as you go up. So for example, by about Bothell, the slough there was then about 3 feet higher. By the time you Lake Sammamish, a couple feet higher. But the slough was straightened by the Army Corps of Engineers at various points, starting in, say, the 1930s. So that area now, like out where the 60 acres soccer fields are and stuff, where the slough is just a drainage ditch. Well, yeah, that's not natural. That was done. It used to be windy all through that valley. That's why there's good farming out there and good soil, is because of the river ran through there for so long. But you had to navigate all of that with a boat if you were going to Lake Sammamish. So it added a lot to your time if you're doing this sort of thing, and you got to get out and chop trees out of the way that fell across the slough and all kinds of things. So it was a major adventure getting back and forth there, doing their thing. But they had that boat. They started building some boats on their property. They later sold some of their property to a couple of Kirkland guys who established a boatyard there, Barrich and Tompkins. And I never pronounced Barrich's name right. Barch. It's a Swiss name. And they operated steamboats on the lake and built some there. And later they combined with a Lake Washington steamboat operator named John Anderson. And that enterprise began a shipyard that lasted up into really the end of World War II. It was there as a winter tie-up, some other things even in through my lifetime. But as a shipbuilding facility, it was at its peak at World War II. But that all started in there with the Curtises. They also operated boats out in the Sound. They talk about having built a boat called the Peerless at their house, and then to take the boat out, they had to take it down that Black River I told you about, that came out of the lake around Renton. The problem was it was very shallow, so you could get boats in and out of Lake Washington from the salt water, but you had to do it during a time of rain when the water was at its highest. And then they would usually stop at the native village down there and hire a couple of guys to help them. So you imagine all these guys, these crews with ropes and stuff on the lines on their boats, trying to haul them up and down this river. It was a major undertaking. But as early as the very early 1870s, when they started mining coal in the Newcastle area, that was the only way you could get these little steamboats into the lake. It was a big undertaking. So their boat, the Peerless, went out into the salt water. They had a lot of relatives. A lot of their descendants were also involved in the ferry system out on Lake Washington. So they're really more than anything else associated with lake transportation for the earliest days. So you've heard us mention a couple of times J.C. O'Connor and his wife Eve, they were very early arrivals. I actually think they very well could have been here before the Frenches, but they had different pieces of land. They wheeled and dealed a little bit. Ended up with a smaller parcel of land kind of back behind the main water area, kind of back up where State Street is, in sort of that area. He was a Civil War vet. He came very early, and in the early 1870s was working in steamboating on Lake Washington. There was a coal mining was going on at what is now Newcastle, and they used to take the coal from Newcastle along a railway to the Pleasure Point area of Bellevue, which is a big hillside, then down across what is now 405. They had what was called an incline railway that went down to the lake where they had a wharf. Now this is in the early 1870s. This is out in the woods. There's nothing, suddenly you have this big wharf and this incline coming down the hillside. The steamboats would run these barges with the coal cars on them across the lake to the Montlake Portage. They would take the cars off, portage them across the little isthmus there to Lake Union, put them on another barge, take them with another steamer down Lake Union, because remember there's no Montlake Cut at this time, down to the very south end of Lake Union, which was then just woods, not a Tony kind of a millennial want to live kind of place like it is now. And then the Seattle's very first railway was from the south end of Lake Washington, or Lake Union, to the foot of Pike Street, where they would go down another incline to a major wharf, and the coal would then be loaded onto the ships. So the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company, which owned that enterprise, they were based out of San Francisco because the Seattle investors screwed it up by infighting, naturally. They had to handle that 11 times, handle that coal to get it down there. So in some capacity, O'Connor was running on those boats out on the lake, on Lake Washington. I suspect that he had started, he had his land in Kirkland, went down there and was working for the coal company, and then ended up back in Kirkland, and he got into steamboating. He was involved in the Squawk, which was actually built by a guy named Ed Lee, L-E-E, whose descendant happens to be himself a nautical historian who we've connected with. He's kind of a very interesting guy. So he was involved in the Squawk, but then he had Lee build him his own boat called the Lura Maud, which is the most misspelled vessel ever in Washington State. Lura, his daughter, is over here, but note the spelling is L-U-R-A, and then it's Maud. His other daughter is Maud with no E. So he had this boat, the steamer, the Lura Maud, that would run across the lake, and then when the Peter Kirk era started in the 1889, 1890, what was happening is they were having a lot of their machinery and things shipped over from England. It would go on what was called the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad from the docks, offloaded on a ship, go on the railroad. Its rail line through Seattle we now know as the Burke-Gilman Trail. It would go to the town of Yesler, which was on Union Bay, which is sort of down roughly where U Village is now. That was a little sawmill town called Yesler that had been platted and established by Seattle co-founder, grumpy old man Henry Yesler. And then it was loaded onto the Lura Maud, taken across the lake to the foot of Market Street, where the company had a wharf and a warehouse. Some of it was hauled up Market and then up 7th to the mill site. Other was just kept down there in the warehouse. But we also see the Lura Maud because we have records, because of a good friend of mine is a Northern Pacific Railway Historical Society officer, geek, just expert on this stuff. So we actually got the rail freight records of this stuff being loaded on the Lura Maud. And one of the things this boat was used for was to haul materials to Yarrow Point, which is where Lee Hunt, who I mentioned earlier, the guy that helped convince Peter Kirk to locate here, was having his mansion built. And his estate was called Yarrow. So what's kind of funny is Lee Hunt owned Yarrow Point. Well, his wife was having a problem with the view because there was trees on the next point over. So Lee Hunt bought the point had a patch of trees cut down, and you can even see this on old maps. It's just a patch, so that she had her view. And we now know that one is Hunt's Point. So there you have it. But we see O'Connor's freight records, them bringing in all these, first it's building materials, then it's decorating materials, and they spent a lot of money on his mansion, which is actually was kind of modest by today's standards. You kind of look at the pictures of it, you expected something to say, oh, okay. Interestingly, we just discovered that it is still standing on Yarrow Point. There's a lot of houses and stuff around it now, but it's actually still there. Right, so he also, very entrepreneurial guy. He built a place on the lake in Houghton, roughly across from where Doris Cooper Houghton Beach is today. That was called Lake House. It's very important. It's Lake House. It's not the Lake House. I spent most of my life calling it the Lake House, but a fish descendant was a friend of KHS and was very quick to point out that it was just called Lake House. The O'Connors sold to the Fish family there, and we happen to have a descendant over here who operated it. That thing stood until what, 84, something like that, over there in Houghton. It was one of those really sad things that got torn down, but it was like a little overnight little hotel, bed and breakfast. You know, I don't know exactly what you'd call it. It's not as formal as a hotel, but people would stop there for the night, because if you want to go on to Redmond, I mean, you know, you come across one day from Seattle, you got to rest when you get to Houghton after all you've been through to get up, even up the Lake Washington Wagon Road, which is what Madison Street became known as, or had been known as. So they would overnight at Lake House and then go the rest of the journey over to Redmond from there. So it was an in-between place. And again, it was standing until about 84 when they put the current little office building in. Oh yeah, here we go. Here he is in his Civil War uniform. I haven't done the research on his Civil War career. We'll save that for the Civil War tour. I don't know what actions or anything he was engaged in. These guys, everybody was Union. Around here, everybody.
Do you know what state he was from?
New York, I believe.
Oh, okay.
He was in artillery. I do know that.
He died in 1910. Was he from modern? Lee Hunt looked modern. He looked modern.
Yeah.
People looked like old people in 1910, but a lot of people in Kirkland really look modern, like they could look today, and you wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the Civil War pictures, if they had better haircuts, they could be us. Yeah, they do. They look just like us.
Let's go over this one. One thing I would mention just real quick. The Osbergs actually, if you know McAuliffe Park, the oldest barn in the area is still standing there. They bought that from the pioneer settlers whose name had been Langdon. They bought it from Roland Langdon in the early 1900s. What's kind of interesting about the Osbergs is they gave the land to their daughter, whose married name was Johnson, and then they gave it to their daughter, whose married name was McAuliffe. So, and then it became McAuliffe Park. Sadly, Miss McAuliffe passed away of brain cancer a number of years ago. She was a very, very nice lady. I was a little kid, I knew all of them. The McAuliffe kids and I grew up together. But it was the names changed. But from Roland Langdon, the first settlers, to Kirkland acquiring that as a park, there's only two different families that ever owned that land. And it's still a nice, big, huge piece of it. So, here we are at Reginald Collins was from Indiana, and Lee Hunt convinced him to come out here and told him he would have a job for him with Kirkland Land Improvement Company. So Collins moved his family out here, and by the time he got here, there's no job. But he kind of liked it, so he stayed. Now, you've got the pioneer period, you've got the Kirk-boom period, then you have the period after the Panic of 1893 and that financial depression. The town had largely cleared out, but the people who stayed were a very resilient, hardy type of person that then went on ultimately to incorporate the fourth-class town of Kirkland in 1905. Collins was one of those people. He didn't get mad that Hunt, he found other things to do. He started wheeling and dealing in real estate. Wheeling and dealing in real estate was not that easy since most of the area was owned by the Kirkland Land Improvement Company. Even after the mill discontinued and construction efforts discontinued and it was left to sit, the Land and Improvement Company continued. They were doing things like hoping to try to entice other steel manufacturers into taking over the site. And then they also believed residential development would be a possibility as well. So there was not a ton of land for him to be able to buy and sell, but there was some. So he built a little office on the lake at what we now consider downtown Kirkland, off what is called Lake Street. Well, then and now. Now, the thing is, when the lake was that much higher, 9.5 feet higher, the water came up to what is now Lake Street. So the original Lake Street was built on pilings right at the edge of the lake. The buildings to the west side of Lake Street, which is like where Penny's and Richardson's and all that stuff used to be, which is now, what is it, the Lodge and the Seduce Boutique and those things, that was all lake. So he built his little real estate office on pilings near what became the ferry landing in 1900 at the foot of Kirkland Avenue. What's kind of interesting is that little real estate office was there. The 1939 property assessor photos, it's still Collins, still R.H. Collins real estate office. What's interesting about it is it's actually still there. 1918, the land development company called Burke and Farrar, who in 1910 assumed the assets of the old Kirkland Land and Improvement Company. And by the way, Burke and Farrar, Peter Kirk himself had a sizable stock position in Burke and Farrar. Kirk died in 1916, but he never gave up on Kirkland, even though he moved and had to move to the San Juan Islands. But that little office is actually still there. If you like, next to where Seduce Boutique is on Lake Street, there's a little tiny little nail salon business.
Yeah.
That's still his old office. If you were to go down to the bowels of that little thing, there's pilings down there from when that was out over the lake. What's also kind of interesting, and I wish I had it, we have a picture from not long after the lake was lowered that is standing on the newly reclaimed land facing east, and you see that building that had been constructed by Burke and Farrar that's actually still there on the northwest corner of Kirkland Avenue and Lake Street. So you have that Burke and Farrar building, you have the R.H. Collins building, and then the newly exposed, what had been lake bottom, is all flowers, and like cultivated flowers, not just like garden flowers, but people planting flowers, you know, for commercial purposes. And there's a little sign up on the side that the nursery business was named after a family named Sherbrooke. So you've got this beautiful picture, and they would cut the flowers, and you had car ferry coming in there as of 1900, and the kids would go out and sell flowers to people that were waiting in line at the ferry. So it's kind of, you know, they walk up to you, you're sitting there, what are you going to do? Not buy your wife flowers when the little kid comes up? But the Sherbrooke Nursery continued well into the 20th century. They had a presence up around the 7th and Market area. There's old family movies of their nursery area with all this stuff in the background, and it looks like the countryside. And Dave Sherbrooke over here, the Kirkland Heritage Society, is a descendant of that family. So it's kind of wild seeing that old picture with all these people all tied in together. Dave had a career at the Bellevue School District, and he's recently been yanked out of retirement to rejoin the KHS board.
And you should take some credit because you did a little Paul Dorpat imitation by being able to blow that photo up to find the sign with the name on it.
That was fun.
You deserve a hell of a lot of credit.
I should have had Lolita make that one too. It's a great photo. It's hand colorized, but it's looking like now there's coffee and cone, and the Grape Choice wine is down there looking up. But it's just funny how all the little pieces of the families tie together. But Collins did development. There's a part of Kirkland up from Houghton called Collins Wood. There was the Collins School that by my era, was referred to as special ed years later. So I always thought of him as kind of an unsung hero. He was the guy that didn't intend to be mayor, but when called, he served. Did all the different little jobs in town through that really bust era that
took Kirkland on to the next level and had the vision of seeing Kirkland as a suburban, kind of a nice community that we know today. Because don't get too nostalgic about the steel enterprise not having worked out here. That would have been really gross if it had. Imagine, any of you been to Pittsburgh? It's like slag heaps, and I mean, it would not have been the nice place that it is today. So it's kind of fun to talk about and look about what they had envisioned. But the way things went turned out to be a lot better for us. So that's a story of Kirkland's sort of first mayor.
I'll just tell you one quick thing too while we're walking. I don't do like a ghost tour thing. That's just not my deal. I respect the history here, so it's just not my thing. I lived in the East for a while. They would do that up in Gettysburg, and it's just kind of fun.